Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do another video following up on secular humanism, secular morality. C.S. Lewis ends the first essay of his book, The Abolition of Man, with a great line. He was noting in the book that the people that he is contending with in his essays have undercut their own philosophical positions sufficient to the task at hand. At this time, such as is the tragic comedy of our situation, we continue to clamor for those very qualities we are rendering impossible. We can hardly open a periodical without coming across a statement that our civilization needs to have more drive, or dynamism, or self sacrifice, or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. It's one of my favorite lines of C.S. Lewis. Terrific, terrific conversation between Coleman Hughes and John McWhorter. Coleman Hughes has started his own podcast. Many of you know Coleman Hughes. He's written for Quillette. He's had a number of, I think, terribly insightful essays. I'm amazed at the talent that this young man has. And he's a student at Columbia, where John McWhorter teaches. It tells a nice little story in this video about first bumping into him. And he's just delightful to listen to. He thinks for himself. He's clear-headed, and the whole video, the whole conversation between these two is well worth listening to. But I wanted to play part of it because it really grasped part of what I've been thinking about in terms of secular humanism and its ability to actually grapple with the demands of the world.
I want to get back to the religion point because this is a point you've been making for years now, and there's one piece in the Daily Beast, one in the Atlantic, that anti-racism takes on the character of a religion. And it's interesting to me that with your conversations with Glenn Lowry at Blogging Heads, which you're now known is kind of its own space for you and Glenn. Yeah. That's an
Those conversations with Glenn Lowry are some of my favorites. I love those videos.
Interesting point of tension between you and Glenn, because whenever you talk about anti-racism as a religion, that certainly rings true to me, and I like that framing because there are so many similarities with how you're not supposed to act.
Now, it's funny listening to them talk about religion because obviously, especially if you've been watching my last videos, what we're talking about when we use this word is not easy or clear. John McWhorter's sense is that it's a very common sense. It's a whole narrative in which we are embedded and find meaning, and this reorients our world and basically tells this world that is very large and rather chaotic, and we never quite know what to do, but the religion moves us in a direction and tells us what to do, provides us with meaning, and really helps us try to make the world better, but all, of course, within the confines of this narrative.
Ask pesky questions simply rings true to me, and I like that framing because there are so many similarities with how you're not supposed to ask pesky questions. There's a symmetry between original sin and white privilege. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of reverence for history in religion as well as in
a mysterious future where
right.
everything's going to be resolved.
Right. There's reparations will be a reawakening, begins to sound somewhat like the rapture. But Glenn comes from more of a perspective that's more sympathetic to religion, so the analogy doesn't seem to quite do the same job in his mind that it does.
And I haven't done a lot of videos from McWhorter and Lowry, but they occupy a lot of headspace for me. Glenn Lowry's story in particular, I think he's been working on a book, a memoir of sorts, because he's got a very interesting history with Christianity. He has a video with I forget his name, Wright, I believe his name is, the guy who runs the bloggingheads.tv channel, where Glenn sort of walks through his story, and it's a powerful story, and it's sort of a sad story where Glenn really wanted to inhabit the world that Christianity provided for him and that the church provided for him, but he just, on the heels of a tragic story, he just couldn't believe it, couldn't bear to do it, and so he gave it up. And when he tells that tale, it's a sad tale of longing, and I was deeply moved by that story. I should probably do a video on it just as such, but
for yours
rubs him the wrong way. Yeah.
Right. But I was on a podcast a few months ago with my friend Yasha Monk, and we were talking about this, and he asked me a question that I thought was a very good one.
He asks good questions. Yeah.
He does, which is,
I'm going to have to look up that podcast.
So, assuming that there is a kind of religious impulse intrinsic to human beings, and given that Christianity is somewhat in decline, at least in the circles you and I would run in,
Mm-hmm.
the circles that are being overtaken by anti-racism,
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to critique anti-racism as a religion, but it's another thing to say what would replace it.
Mm-hmm.
And it is amazing to me how focused we are on this. And this is not a new thing. If you read philosophy and theology for the last 150 years, this is what everyone is trying to do. Rudolf Bultmann, liberal theology. How can we, Schleiermacher, how can we establish a new religion that takes the place of fading Christianity, that can afford to us what it has given us? And in many ways, that's Jordan Peterson's question. And Peterson sort of goes right to the edge in terms of being an agnostic, not an atheist, an agnostic. Now, the individuals in these videos are going to stake their identity on atheism, but a religion that is not a religion. John Vervaeke's project, where Alistair McGrath pushes Brett Weinstein, and it almost sounds like you're talking about a new religion. That there's a sense that we have an understanding what the richness of religion afforded us. David Fuller's conversation with Andrea Lewis. I just don't think Christianity can come back, David says. And so this haunting anxiety of the post-Christian, appreciating the loss, having seen the dynamism and the fruit of that dynamism, and fearing it's gone. Well, this isn't in many ways different from the anxiety that many religious people have, because I remember my mother-in-law, who was a fundamentalist Baptist, talking about young people just don't seem to have the consecration we had when we were young. Okay, and of course, hearing that when I was young, I'm thinking, that's kind of interesting. It's is this normal kind of hindsight anxiety, or I think they have a real point, and he's about to make it here.
Given that there is a whole,
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to critique anti-racism as a religion, but it's another thing to say what would replace it.
Mm-hmm.
Given that there is a religion-shaped hole that needs to be filled with something.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that I came up with some answer, but I didn't have a great answer.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And McWhorter just very quietly said, that's a tough one. I mean, it was hard to hear, and I didn't catch it the first time. Usually when I do a video like this, I've only listened to this once because I just listened to it today.
It almost certainly is and I've thought about this quite a bit, actually. It's partly something that a secular person might almost viscerally crave. You almost seek the mysticism. You'll almost seek wanting to believe in something larger. Certainly you seek belonging. And whether you're white or black, all of those, high fives that people do when they, basically mention some anti-racist tenet or some analysis, that Alex McNabb was all about racism, right? And then you'll watch people do it. All of that is about connection. yes, human beings need that. And I don't think it's an accident that rather, secular, even pagan, mostly overeducated, affluent whites are so Mormon-style religious about race. But
It's hysterical.
to be honest, I'll give you a very chill
Mormon style. I'd love to pause and say, tell me more about that Mormon style. You're an East Coaster. I mean, if I grew up, they're in Columbia. I grew up in Patterson. I was, grew up in. I didn't know any Mormons growing up till I moved to the West Coast. Now, Mormons are all over the place, but Mormon style is fascinating.
chilly answer. I think that race. But to be honest, I'll give you a very chilly answer. I think that is, and I say this as an atheist. I don't like to talk about this too much, but that doesn't mean I don't talk about it at all. I do not believe in God at all. I am not agnostic. I am an atheist. And I don't feel bereft about it. And as far as I'm concerned, the anti-racist thing, to the extent that it's religious, and yes, I mean this, and I'm not going to walk it back, is a slide backwards. I think that humanity would be better off, it won't happen in my lifetime, humanity would be better off without religious thought of that kind, because that kind of thought is anti-empirical. I think we should be as comfortable as we can with empiricism and dealing with fact. I won't be writing a book arguing the point. But to the extent that people find anti-racism so attractive, it's because there's a part of us that reaches back to.
So he's laid his cards on the table. This is John McWhorter. I mean, this is what he does, and he's not going to apologize. This is what I think. Low in agreeableness, probably. Here are the cards on the table. I'm an atheist. I'm not an agnostic. They're low in empiricism. They're not. I mean, so in a sense, he sort of lays himself out as a modernist, and well, there it is. And to the degree that they're doing this, they're taking a step backward. Well, he's got more to say.
I won't be writing a book arguing the point. But to the extent that people find anti-racism so attractive, it's because there's a part of us that reaches back to what we're founded upon, which is that we are social beings. That some people would argue that evolutionarily we almost need to believe in something beyond the mundane.
So he's not going to, challenge this observation, this very empirical observation that religion fits a space that people need. Now, just a few minutes before said, yeah, that's a hard one. So he doesn't necessarily have an answer for it, but he's basically saying, hey, that I've already got my job, my calling in the world cut out, and I write and I do things, but this is what I think.
Probably helps knit people together socially, which would have gotten passed down in genes. But if we're going to do what human beings do well and do it better, we've got to let go of anything.
Now, when I get into the next video I'm going to play, just put a little flag here and what human beings do well. Remember the category, okay? And I've talked about this in the previous videos, that there's this category called human beings. And this is, John Gray's going to argue, Tom Holland has argued, this is a result of Christianity, of the totalizing nature of Christianity, okay?
That involve what human beings do well and do it better. We've got to let go of anything that involves carefully turning a blind eye to facts in the quest for a warm but inchoate sense of belonging that, as often as not, impedes rather than fosters social justice. And
okay, so again, he's saying it's sort of a Jesse Ventura argument that, well, some of these social justice warriors, it's them, they got to kind of huddle up and find their identity in their herd and in their group, and that's why they're doing this, but it's regressive. Now, again, so McWhorter very much lays his cards on the table as sort of a progressive modernist, but says that the branch of progressivism that are these social justice warriors, that's the wrong branch they took. But you can understand them taking it because they're feeling like they need one another, and sociology factors kick in here. You gain status, and Joe Rogan likes talking about that, where these male feminists basically say feminist things in order to sleep with feminists, and I'm sure there's that dynamic's true.
So as far as I'm concerned, no, nothing should replace it, because there are a great many people who really aren't religious in any way, who I wouldn't say are miserable, or if they are, it's not because they need to find Jesus, nor is it that they need to find,
Now, just kind of not because they're miserable. Okay, so that's just a little moment there that kind of maps out. Well, this is what the goal is: to not be miserable. Human happiness is the goal. And again, this is very much a modernist frame. This is a very, very common posture.
The priests, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Jesus, who I wouldn't say are, there fosters social justice. And so as far as I'm concerned, no, nothing should replace it, because there are a great many people who really aren't religious in any way, who I wouldn't say are miserable, or if they are, it's not because they need to find Jesus, nor is it that they need to find, the priests, Ta-Nehisi Coates, or anything else. We just need to learn how to deal with reality.
And it's very interesting, because basically Lewis in The Abolition of Man makes, part of atheist modernism is tough it out, buck up, face reality. The world is hard and cold. So yeah, I know you're huddling together as social justice tribe in order to try and stay warm in the face of the dark coldness of reality, but cowards.
That's tough, but that is what I believe.
I think I have a bit of a disagreement with that, in the sense that I'm also an atheist. I'm someone who certainly always wants to be committed to viewing the world empirically, to not saying things because they feel good, but because they're true. On the other hand, I'm also someone who goes on meditation retreats. I'm kind of a Sam Harris style atheist.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. And at the beginning of this video, Coleman Hughes sort of began with John McWhorter saying, "This is my first podcast," but it comes second in terms of the feed. Sam Harris came first. I don't know if that's because Coleman wanted a bigger name, because Sam Harris has a bigger following, but it was very interesting, because I haven't listened to the Sam Harris conversation yet. This was the conversation I was really interested in.
Quasi-Buddhist,
right?
I see the value of spirituality shorn of irrational beliefs, and
that's so fudgy. Spirituality shorn of irrational beliefs. Well, when you're shearing that, whatever it is you're shearing, that spirituality, tell me what that is.
And one reason I think we, so to speak, are perhaps losing, if I don't want to frame it as a battle, but
now earlier in the podcast they talked about the fact that, and John McWhorter in his latest conversation with Glenn Lowry, when they're talking about MLK, Dr. King's Day, talks about John McWhorter feels some hope, because John McWhorter feels like his efforts have not been fruitless, and that here in the likes of Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter's perspective, his, let's say kind of a modernist perspective, is not dead. And so now he has a young disciple, and well, there might be a future. But now the young disciple's looking around and saying, we're not doing that well, because, well, it seems that the religion stuff really works with human beings. They really like their religion. Now this is very similar to the last secular humanist video that I played, the one with Ross Duthought and Stephen Smith and Tara Burton-Reed, where they simply note that when people become post-Christian, the majority of people don't become sort of atheist, and atheist in a disciplined way. And even Sam Harris, seeks the the amusement park of Buddhist meditation and what that can offer him. So Coleman is looking around as a young man, very much in the trenches, as it were, as a college student, saying, I'm really nervous because, Team Atheist doesn't seem to have the feels like the religion tribe, even if it's a religion we don't like.
In the marketplace of ideas, the ideas you and I tend to push, which are fairly similar, are not winning the day. I think that's clear to say, right? But I think one reason that...
No, but continue.
You don't think so?
No, I know what you mean, but anyway, go
Okay.
ahead.
Let me put it this way. One way in which the narrative, my narrative could feel much stronger and more viscerally true to people is if it had some kind of religious bent to it.
Yeah.
So, for example...
It needs a myth.
When I think of why it's the case that Martin Luther King was so successful talking about brotherhood and the content of our character, a message that is really universal, but people pushing the same message today just get mocked. I think, well, he stood on this religious perch from which he could view the divisiveness of the Black Power movement and white racists as petty and terrestrial relative to the unity that he could say is true of our world in virtue of his being a Christian. He had a meta-narrative that kind of dissolved all of the divisive narratives below.
Now, lately with some of the back and forth on Twitter, I've noticed kind of an appropriation of Dr. King from the social justice side, which I would imagine they would make that play. I read a lot of Dr. King back in my college days. I did for my history thesis, I did a paper on Dr. King. There are other points in my life that I've read a number of biographies of him, a good number of his speeches and sermons. But that's at least a decade or so ago, so I went out on Audible, and you can, for $4, you can pick up a whole, 35 speeches of Dr. King on Audible, and they're recordings, so you can listen to him make them. And I picked up Garrow's biography. I hadn't read Garrow's biography. I've read 3 or 4 biographies of Dr. King, but I hadn't read Garrow, so I picked that up, and I'd buy too many books, more than I have time to read sometimes. But I'll start making my way through that, because this is an area of dear importance to me. Those of you who know my own story and where I grew up and my father's ministry and all of that have an inkling of that. So I decided to sort of go back and check and think, all this social justice stuff is that the King I know? So my daughter was. I was driving my daughter back to college after winter break, and so I listened to about 3 or 4 of his major sermons and talks, and I thought, no, I remember what he was like, and he was a liberalish, neo-orthodox-ish, heavily influenced by Gandhi and Tolstoy, very much used those themes, leveraged the Declaration of Independence very regularly, basically tried to hold America to account to the dream of its founding fathers, updated by understanding that black men were men, and used the word men all the time, and all of that. And Martin Luther King Jr. is a historical figure, and it was about 3-4 years ago, before I started doing my videos, I read another prize-winning biography of Malcolm X, because I didn't know Malcolm X nearly as well as I knew Dr. King, and that was eye-opening and enlightening in terms of black supremacist movements and black. Growing up too, I was fairly well acquainted with the apartheid movement. That was a big cause when I was a college student, divestment. So this history, I won't say I'm an expert in this history, but I'm not unfamiliar with it. And so the point here that Coleman makes is a valid one, because it's unimaginable. The civil rights movement, as we know, as the force we knew it, is unimaginable without the context of Christianity in which it happened. And that's both the black church and the white church, the northern white church and the southern black church. America had a conscience, and that conscience was formed by Christianity, and film on the news in the north of the lynchings, of the injustice in the South, moved a nation, and Dr. King mobilized the language that was in the Bible. That was, you can't listen to him preach and not, unless you've never heard any black preaching, and not have an understanding of church culture or any of that. And he moved, one of the things I talk about in terms of religion is its scalability. You know, he moved not just the intellectuals who had read the kinds of books that he had written, but he moved the churchgoers and the church sitters, and he moved them in a way, he inspired them to nonviolence. If you don't understand nonviolence as being the core of Dr. King's movement, you're not paying any attention to Dr. King's movement. Nonviolence was at the core, and he very much got this from Gandhi. And because not too many years before had been Gandhi's movement in India. There's a really very interesting dual biography of Churchill and Gandhi, and sort of the interchanges between them. Very interesting book that, again, I read before I started all this YouTube stuff. And so Dr. King leverages that, and he imagined that what Mahatma Gandhi did to the British Empire, Dr. King, mobilizing the churches, could do to Jim Crow in the South. And he did it. And it cost him his life. But Coleman Hughes has a real point here that this would not have happened if it were not for the deep commitment to Christianity that population, white and black, had, and how Dr. King was able to preach the nation into a better way.
Mm-hmm. And I find, as an atheist, entering this conversation that has a very religious character, I lack a meta-narrative. You lack a meta-narrative. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a liability for us. And I don't know exactly, that's kind of what Yasha's question exposed to me. And I don't know exactly whether that's fixable, but it's something I noticed.
That is, I completely get you, but this there are two answers. First of all, and here's where I'm going to have to strike that. Well, you weren't around when? No, we're only talking about 20 years ago. That was
an amazing noise.
I'm your age, John.
Looney Tunes old man voice. But back in the day, as in like 1999, to have the kind of message that you and I have, it's interesting the way these days Twitter is discussed by regular people on Twitter, and people talk about the flaming and the vitriol, etc. My thought has always been, people have been treating me that way since the Clinton administration. It's not new to me, because if you were a black apostate, boy, did you hear it. And the people in the middle that we're talking about, generally you didn't really hear from much. They might write you a physical letter. They might write you a quiet email. But people like that felt genuinely silenced, and I think the mood in the country was different. So when I was you, I got praise mostly from white conservatives, and that's great. But as far as black people went, there were a few self-identified black conservatives, but for the most part, there was an awful lot of hate. These days, I think that part of the reason you don't get as much of that as I do, part of the reason that I don't feel as hated as I do now, is because there's a middle group, or even a completely persuadable group, who have more of a sense of being a body, who have less of a sense that they're one of only 17 people. And I think social media encourages that. And I find, next time I open up Twitter, I'm going to find all this hate mail. But I find that for the stuff that I do now, I don't get nearly as much of that shit as I used to. There are people who will say, I don't agree with everything, but I respect what you're saying. That group of people is bigger and or louder now than it was 20 years ago. So that I don't feel like we're losing. I feel like we're smoking people out who feel more comfortable than they used to in saying, yeah, for black people, racism is there, but it isn't everything. And I'm not a bad person if I think this. And more black people who do not need to say they're card-carrying Republicans and or my parents are immigrants to say, yeah, this message that we're being given makes us seem like children. So that's one answer. Second answer, religion. People need something larger. Yeah, that's true. You and I sound chilly. But you know what? I think something could replace the religion. And I think that is something which is going to seem very shallow. We need there to be somebody who does what we do, who sounds better. And what I mean is somebody who probably grew up differently than either you or I did, and who has a much richer, more identifiable Black English cadence and sense of humor than either one of us do. If we could get somebody who had that vocal presence, somebody like Stanley Crouch, who was very useful for that, but
I had to look him up. It's very interesting.
Seems to have receded somewhat lately. That would fill in an awful lot of this religious aspect, because what we're talking about is the viscera. We're talking about warmth. We're talking about sense of belonging. And there'll always be a limit to, I know from my own self, I genuinely feel talking about race, I'm only ever going to be so effective because I sound like this. I do it for someone like you, I do it with Glenn, but I just don't sound right. But if it were somebody like Jelani Cobb, not that he would ever express the views that we do, he would sound right doing it. And so if this keeps going, if there could be a couple of people, and I'm not saying that you or me or Camille or Thomas or Glenn don't sound good, but we need different notes. We need some female notes.
Glenn actually sounds better, but of course he's got a reputation as a conservative, Reagan administration and all of that. And of course he's talking about mobilizing his own community, which pushes me back again to the point I was making before, that Dr. King had the church. And the Reverend Al Sharpton, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, over on the left-hand side of the conversation, that very different part of the conversation than these two, they got some reverends over there. Now, the black church has not been in the same kind of free fall that, let's say, the mainline church has been, but even though the black church has in some ways weathered the storm better than most, the black church is not what it used to be either. At least it's never been in the North as much as it was in the Old South in the Bible Belt. So, point well taken, but it also reinforces my point that there's a context for this, and that this is in fact dependent on the context.
It really sounds almost as if it's basically we 5 or 6 guys and then somebody like Candace Owens. There needs to be 5 or 6, black, pliable, heterodox people who don't walk around offending people, and frankly, who are a little more careful than Candace Owens. I think that
I wondered about her.
We could get somewhere. And I think it could happen within, people are going to play this back and I'm going to sound stupid, but in about 5 years, I think we could see some change. I don't feel as pessimistic as I did, say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago on Blogging Heads, it's been that long. I would say to Glenn, we will never cut through this nonsense. I feel better about it.
I mean,
now.
Wasn't Barack Obama almost that?
Yes, could have been, but social media screwed it up. Social media made it easier to see cop brutality against black people, which is real, and more people ended up knowing about every one of those episodes. Add that and somebody as good as Ta-Nehisi Coates was at writing about it, and then his career, and next thing you know, Barack Obama's symbolism got washed away. If there had been no social media coming in right as that man started occupying the White House, I think we'd be in a different place already. But social history is funny.
Yeah, one opinion floating around the intelligentsia that I think makes very little sense is that Barack Obama set race relations back. I think it's a classic correlation without causation fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I once had a very protracted argument with someone about whether social media was the cause of.
This whole conversation is good, but I want to get on to the next video. So, because the focus there was obviously on the religious aspect, I want to play another video by John Gray. Now, someone in the comments section of my videos had linked a video interview with John Gray that I listened to the whole thing and thought it was really helpful. He was talking about his 7 Types of Atheism book, which I have not read. Interesting chapters: New Atheism, Secular Humanism, A Sacred Relic, he calls it, Strange Faith in Science, Atheism and Gnosticism, God Haters, Atheism Without Progress, and Atheism of Silence. And that Atheism of Silence is very interesting because in some ways he sort of came where John Vervaeke was at the end in terms of John Vervaeke's non-theism. And that really fascinated me, and maybe I'll talk about it at the end of it. But then I found that, as is often the case, the interview was probably done in conjunction with a public lecture that he gave, and whereas I recommend them both to watch because they're quite good, and I'll put the links for them down in the notes below. Just in the interest of time, I thought maybe I'd play some of his lecture because his lecture is a little bit more tailored for public audience than the interview, although both were, I thought, really outstanding and good.
I'll be upfront with you, and it's a sign, I think, as Henke said, of the tolerance and freedom of thought that goes on in many churches today, which is I am myself an atheist. So I speak as an atheist, not as a Christian, not even as a Christian camp follower or a hidden or closet theist, but an atheist, not an agnostic. And perhaps I should say what I mean.
You know, I was really impressed listening to John Gray. Obviously a good scholar, careful with his language, clear with his definitions. You know, these videos were very impressive.
By that, when I say that I'm an atheist, what I mean by that is an atheist to me is someone who either rejects or just doesn't need or use the idea of a creator God, a divine mind, that fashioned this.
Now, rejects or need or use. Notice, rejects, that's propositional. Need or use, that's much more perspectival, participatory in terms of John Vervaeke's 4 Ps. And again, you know, I've talked to a number of you that have said, I just can't do the John Vervaeke stuff. Well, don't worry about it. I mean, what John is really doing is giving a vocabulary for some of this stuff. And if you're philosophically inclined, you might like it. If you're not so, you might find it confusing. That's totally fine. But so we got these 4 Ps, and I like how he, not just the propositional, but the perspectival and the participatory he notes here.
This world and human being either rejects or just doesn't need or use the idea of a creator God, a divine mind that fashioned this world and human beings in it. So you're an atheist, in my way of thinking, if you either reject that idea or just don't have it. Now that, I think you'll see, is quite, although it's a very basic sort of minimalist type definition or formula, it has some consequences which maybe are not so obvious, which is that if you understand atheism in this way, one thing that will follow is that there are atheist religions. Because there are religions in the world, old religions, religions which have had millions and hundreds of millions and still do have hundreds of millions of followers, in which there isn't anything like a creator God that fashioned this world. Most kinds of Buddhism, for example, reject the idea of a creator God and even the idea of an individual soul. They explicitly reject it. So theism, if you like, which is the belief or the assertion that there is a divine mind that created this world and God in it and human beings in it, and furthermore, in many accounts, is the source of what's valuable in the world, underwrites the goodness in the world. Atheism, theism and religion aren't the same.
Again, I wanted to mention I'm really enjoying The Religion of Israel. Fascinating book in terms of asking fundamental questions about, why don't we find paganism in the Old Testament, not just the complaint about idolatry and fetishism. What's going on in this strange book? And a lot of it has to do with really the boundaries of what John Gray is talking about here. This theism that comes from the Bible is a particular type of theism, and this monotheism that launches Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is an entirely different perspective, and I think John Gray articulates it well here, as opposed to really doing some deep forming in my mind about the philosophical options that are at play and exactly what distinguishes them. And I find Gray's thinking here quite clear.
Theism underwrites the goodness in the world. Theism and religion aren't the same. You can be religious without being a theist, and hundreds of millions of Buddhists or Taoists or Confucians or Shintoists and many others, animists, who believe that the world is full of hundreds of mini-gods but that there is no creator God. They would all be in this minimalist.
And there's, again, to pour some of Kaufman's terminology, and there's a meta-divine realm of which, out of which emerges these gods and powers and things, and that fundamentally restructures how we relate to the world. That this meta-divine realm is impersonal, and there it is, and then that as opposed to theism, where that's God, personal God who has will and agency and all of that, from whom the world comes. There's a huge divide here. Now religion is, now he's going to get into various atheist religions, and again he gets that into the other video, and if I had endless time, we'll see how much time I have, but I'd like to play some of that other video, because the other video is excellent too, where he sort of walks through the book and talks about each one, and there's some very interesting book reviews out there. Maybe I'll do another video on the other video, I don't know, we'll see.
Understanding atheists, but they'd also be practicing their different religions. And equally, and I'll come to this later, there can be, when a certain type of atheism, a range of types of atheism that have developed in Europe and in the West and other parts of the world over the last few hundred years, there can be types of atheism which are very like monotheism, which even reproduce many of the ways of thinking of monotheism while rejecting some of its beliefs, that are themselves religions. Religions in the sense that they have many of the same kind of practices, dogmas, heresies and heretics. They satisfy the same psychological needs, and they have many of the same essential messages, but leave out, or attempt to leave out, a creator God. So that's what how I think of myself. I think of myself as an atheist in the sense that I don't have that idea. I also think that this is a slightly different question. I also think that this life is all that I can be sure of, and that when I die, that's it. I'm gone. Nothing left. The story's over. And that may be important because I think one of the roots of religion, in both its theistic and other forms, is the shock of mortality. How do we differ from the other animals? I accept broadly the Darwinian theory as the best approximation of the truth, which is that we are animals, not like animals, we are animals. Our minds are animal minds. They've evolved in the way that other animal minds have evolved. But how do we differ from other animals? Some people say we make tools, we have languages, we reflect upon ourselves. I think the main difference, or the one which has very profound and far-reaching effects, is that unlike the other animals, we know that our lives are finite. It may be that elephants and some other animals have a kind of instinctive response to the death of their kin, of other elements. But it looks as if we are the only animal, as far as we can tell, which has a definite, clear understanding, not of what death is, because actually none of us knows. I simply act on the assumption that it's the end for me. I don't actually know.
I like how he acts as if death is the end, and it's sort of a twist of the Jordan Peterson act as if God exists.
But we have a definite understanding that our lives are limited and finite and are going to come to an end. And that, I think, changes everything for us, because it means that, unlike the other animals, I think we're inclined, constitutively, you might say, by being human, to try and construct our lives in the form of a coherent story. Because
I'm not sure where he puts those two things together. Now, I agree that our knowledge of death very much changes us from animals, but I'm not sure the story emerges out of that. I think they're actually two separate things, but we'll go on.
we know it's going to end. We have a deep-seated need to find a meaning in our lives, both individually and collectively.
And again, I'm not sure death is the thing that gives us meaning, but
A need. Because we know it's going to end. We have a deep-seated need to find a meaning in our lives.
And you know, the fact that if you're watching the video instead of just listening to the podcast, I mean, he's clearly giving this in an old church. The cross is on the wall, the saints are carved into the pulpit, and people are sitting in very church-like situations. It's very, very interesting.
Both individually and collectively, as a coherent story, which in some sense diminishes the shock of death. And
so, I'm not sure the story actually diminishes the shock of death. I think in many ways the story nature, I've talked a lot about this because our story doesn't decay even as our body decays. And I think that's part of the reason we feel displaced. As C.S. Lewis notes at the beginning of Mere Christianity, we feel like death is an intruder because stories don't decay, but our bodies do die. And so I'm not sure exactly why he puts those things together like he does here.
Other animals aren't like this. I may entertain,
as far as we know,
surprise or amuse you by telling you that my next book is about cats.
I hope John Vervaeke doesn't hold this against him.
Cats and the meaning of life. I've lived with cats, cherished cats. My wife and I have had cats for many years. Our cat
Dog people are better, trust me.
at the moment is 22 years old, so it's quite a long-lived cat. And I've never seen my cat meditating on the imminence of death. I've never seen it either.
You know, cats sit there I've currently got a cat and a dog because of my daughter. And cat does a lot of sitting around, looking around, and what he's pondering, cat has never told me.
Or I guess that turning its life into a story. Some people say that cats have no sense of time, they live in a perpetual now. That's not true. He wakes us both up every morning about 4:30 when he wants his breakfast, so he has a very clear idea of when his breakfast is due and a clear idea of the passage of time.
Your cat is spoiled.
But most animals don't tell their lives as stories. Humans do. The bleak birth, copulation, death, T.S. Eliot, is too little for human beings to tolerate, especially since any story that they might be able to contrive around that, those bare facts, can be disrupted. If not by their own death, then by the death of their loved ones. If not by the death of a loved human being, by the death of a whole city, or a whole country, or a whole way of life.
Now, what's interesting here is that he's just subtly moved the imaginary, because we were talking about physical death and the death of a human being and talking about the story. And when he changes it to the death of a culture, or the death of a city, or a death of a way of life, or something like that, he's made a subtle shift. And now when we're talking about the death of a way of life, that is an abstracted reality. That is, in fact, the embodiment of something that he's going to address later in this talk. That the strange things that human beings do are construct let's say, principalities, or can't help but participate in principalities, communal entities that have personality, that something like Uncle Sam or Santa Claus. But so pay attention to that little move he just made here.
Loved ones, if not by the death of a loved human being, by the death of a whole city or a whole country or a whole...
Because cities are mental frameworks. There's an essence to the city. There's a principality to the city. There's a character of the city that we distill. And, I can't help but have been, I've learned so much from John Vervaeke in this, and in thinking in a little bit more disciplined way about essences and relevance realization. So to identify a city is to identify an essence of sort, whether that essence exists as such out there, or if we're nominalists and we're imposing it on. But let's pay attention to this subtle move he makes in this part of the lecture.
Whole way of life, which has actually happened many times in the 20th century and is happening actually today. So with those threats to meaning around us, and with the idea, perhaps not the idea, but the sense of our mortality pressing on us, human beings turn to religion. That's one of the reasons they do.
And when he says turn to religion, that he's using a definition of religion in that sense, okay? And again, if you sort of follow that through here, you'll notice that these words are pretty fudgy. They move around, and so when he uses the word within the context of the sentence, pay attention to what he probably means by it.
So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about basically two things. The first is the variety of atheist values. The variety of atheist values. And here I'm putting on my hat as a historian of ideas, and I want to communicate something of the diversity of values that different atheists at different times have actually held. And they're not just diverse values. In many cases, they're opposed values. Why do I think it's important to understand that? Well, nearly all atheists today, most at any rate, are liberals, what might be called liberal humanists. That's to say they believe in human rights, human freedom, individuality, they need to be fair, they oppose discrimination and exclusion, and they often think there's some essential connection between their atheism and these liberal values. But historically speaking, most atheists have not been liberals, and even now atheists have a whole different variety of conceptions of the good, what a good society would be like, or what a good human being would be like. So the first thing I want to talk about is the variety of atheist values. And the second thing I want to talk about is morality itself. We all think we know what we mean by morality, but do we? What is this special area of life, supposedly more important than any other, that we call morality? I mean, we think of morality as being some kind of set of values that have they're overriding. They override other values like self-interest, or maybe even aesthetics, beauty, profit, whatever, and they're universal. We think that most atheists think that these values apply to and have authority over all human beings.
Now, what I like about the move he makes here is he doesn't say objective. Because I think many of the debates that I hear between Christians, atheists, anti-theists, everybody gets hung up on this objective word. And universal is a better word, because universal locates this as, well, this should apply to all. Whereas objective smuggles in a whole bunch of other philosophy that really isn't necessary to the conversation. So I think cutting the objective word in this sense and talking about universal word is better, as I think we'll see as he develops this.
But if you abandon theism, if you really get rid of theism, if you really leave it behind, does the idea of morality that we have survive? Is the idea of morality that I've just described as a kind of an overriding area of human value, which is more important than any of the others, and which is somehow universal in its demands?
Now, when we get into the question of the meta-divine realm versus theism, I think, as I think through these ideas more and go further into it, I can really also see how when it comes to morality, that difference is also germane. Because in a sense, the impersonality of the meta-divine realm versus the personalism of the theism does impact morality. Because in some ways, all of the persons beneath the meta-divine realm, sort of like Odysseus, make their own way to the ends that they have. Whereas obviously in a full theistic situation, the owner has ends that the owner determines.
Does that really survive? Or do we really have to think quite differently about the good life and how to live, and maybe adopt other traditions of thinking about it, like, for example, I'll come back to that later, a Greek tradition in which ethics is held to include not just what we think of as right and wrong behavior, but even things like hygiene, things like beauty, ethics for the ancient Greeks.
I've been reading Persian Fire, and Tom Holland's treatment of the Spartans I thought was really excellent, and I hadn't had quite that take on the Spartans. Fascinating.
It was really the whole art of life, how to live well. And there wasn't a kind of assumption either that the answers that would be given to how to live well would be the same for everybody. They might be different for different people. In that sense, it might not be universal. So we might have to start thinking not just about...
He spends too long in the introduction for this speech. I really want him to get going.
Different moralities, but really about what morality itself is. Let me look briefly at some of the atheist moralities that have developed in Western countries over the last couple of hundred years ago. Well, one that I like to study, by the way, I hope some of you who take these issues extremely seriously won't be offended by this, but I often find passages of great comedy in these deep issues. One thing that I'm quite interested in is Auguste Comte, the 19th century French philosopher and sociologist. He invented the word sociology, and the first sociologist. Any of you heard of him? Auguste Comte. And he was an interesting fellow. He wasn't altogether sane. He sometimes signed himself Bonaparte. That gives you a clue. He founded a religion. He called it the Religion of Humanity, which had a pope. That was him. It was immensely successful. You'd think it wouldn't have been. It was. It was very successful. Spread many parts of the world. Spread to Vietnam, Brazil, London, Britain, Liverpool. Had churches. Had a huge influence on numerous people.
And this was fascinating because he had mentioned Comte, and I'd heard about him for years, read bits and pieces of him for years. He'll show up in philosophy 101 courses, and father of positivism. I didn't know that he invented the word sociology, but this is really part of the reason I'm playing this video instead of the other video for this conversation is Comte had an understanding of the power of religion, and so in the recession of Christendom, he saw in many ways what Coleman Hughes was seeing and says, I have to deploy this, and we need to deploy this full strength. And again, we've seen with Sunday assemblies, we've seen various atheist groups try this, but historically here we have a movement where someone was really quite successful at it, and that really caught my attention.
John Stuart Mill, the great liberal political... Vietnam, Brazil, London, Britain, Liverpool, had churches, had a huge influence on numerous people. John Stuart Mill, the great liberal political theorist and moral philosopher. George Eliot, the famous novelist, were among them. The engineers who built the Panama Canal were disciples of Comte. It was huge, absolutely huge, almost forgotten now, but very, very important. Now, the religion that he invented, he called the religion of humanity, and he thought the core of this religion was altruism, that's to say, sympathy for others. He invented...
It's like, this sounds really familiar, even though it's completely forgotten and has gone away.
The word was altruism, that's to say, sympathy for others. He invented the word altruism. It was he who first coined it. So he thought that instead of having a transcendental object of worship, God, who created mankind and the world, what human beings should do is instead have an ideal conception of humanity, and he said in future the supreme being would be humanity. It's quite explicit about this, the supreme being. And he imagined a church with priests, modeled on the Catholic Church, and rituals. The rituals have a certain flavor today. One of the rituals he favored and instructed his followers follow and adopt was one in which I should mention, he was a phrenologist. You know what that means? He believed that the emotions and movements of the human heart and soul were determined by, or could be gauged by bumps on the head. So what he advised that they do every day, he was also a numerologist, is that they touch the bumps on their head on the where the impulses for benevolence and altruism were placed. And if they did that regularly several times a day, they would become more benevolent and more generous. He also invented a type of clothing, positivist clothing, with the buttons up the back. And the reason for this was if people couldn't put their own clothes on by themselves or take them off by themselves, they would be more altruistic, he reasoned. Really true. But he was a profound thinker in one sense, maybe more than one sense. He assumed that human beings in the future, as in the past, would need a religion. He was not one of those atheists who thought that religion would die out as a pre-scientific form of thinking. He did think that the coming age would be purely scientific. But for that reason, what was needed was a religion based on science and compatible with science and based on science. And this was the religion of humanity. Now, interestingly for us today, he had a huge influence, but he was not what we would now call a liberal. He hated liberalism. He hated individualism. He said that what he wanted was a world to recreate a kind of society like the Middle Ages, but without God and without Christianity, with a different religion. It would be hierarchical.
Isn't that fascinating?
There'd be experts at the top. He said the experts at the top would answer all the ethical questions. You'd say, should I marry so-and-so? You just put something in the post and with the details, and you'd eventually get an answer. That's not really caricaturing it. He thought that what could be, that moral knowledge could be turned into a science, that there could be a science of ethics. Many people today still think this. Sam Harris, the American new atheist, thinks exactly this, though I don't think he's ever read Comte. He was against individualism, and in fact, one of the influences of his thought, he had a great impact on interesting people and admirable people like John Stuart Mill and George Eliot, but he also had an impact in France and elsewhere on later fascist thinkers. The founder of the French fascist movement, the 30s, National Front National, and the philosopher, thinker, Charles Maurras, who was an atheist, was tremendously influenced by Comte because he too wanted this was nationalist, anti-Semitic, anti-gay, anti-Roma, anti-everything kind of movement. He wanted something like Comte's society, his ordered hierarchical society. But unlike Comte, he thought the old religions were better suited to human beings than something like the religion of humanity. So he actually, though he was an atheist, he was a big supporter of established churches. So it had an enormous, so he's in some ways I think a rather profound thinker, more so than the so-called new atheists like Dawkins and Dennett and others, because he understood that the need for a religion, something like a coherent story of the place in the world of humanity, of human history, and something like a need for an object even of worship, went with being human. It would never go away. So they needed a religion, so he invented one.
And again, I mean, the reason I'm playing this video is because when I heard Coleman Hughes's counter to John McWhorter, I thought, yeah, this is Coleman. You're seeing with real eyes here.
Sadly, it even had a Virgin Mary, which was a married woman he fell in love with, who died before they could ever consummate their love, and he set up
not quite a married woman he fell in love with, probably not a virgin.
Her grave as an object of pilgrimage for his followers. So it went right down to the last details. Now,
and again, I mean, I kind of chuckle, but people need something to venerate, and you watch people will, if they're not given something that is actually decent, they'll venerate really stupid stuff. It's part of how we are.
And what's the point of that? Well, for him, atheist values were a kind of surrogate version or an emptied out version of Christian values. All human beings were entitled to love or compassion or concern. Altruism was the essence of morality. Compare that with...
And again, read Tom Holland's Dominion, the history of that. Where does it come from? But again, all the way back to Comte, this anxiety of we're losing Christendom, and he in fact wants, gonna redo the whole Catholic Church, but without a God. It's like, well, that's interesting.
The morality preached by the most widely read atheist in the world. Can any of you guess who that is? The most widely read atheist in the world. Well, it's not Nietzsche, and it's not Marx. It's Ayn Rand. You all know who Ayn Rand is. I never got the chance to meet her, sadly, though I did meet, when I lived in America in the 80s, I did meet many of her disciples. She is the only 20th century atheist, I think, to have had an impact on politics, at least after the Second World War. Atheists think atheists, right? And her books have sold in millions and millions and millions. She's a hugely influential figure.
This part of the lecture was fascinating for me too. I mean, again, the other lecture is awesome, but I listened to this, I thought, nah, this I gotta attach to the Coleman John McWhorter talk.
Couldn't call her really a philosopher, but she's an inventive and colourful writer. Now, what does she say atheist values are? Egoism. Egoism. She says the true atheist considers himself or herself solely from the standpoint of their own individual rational interests. If you're an atheist, you'll be a rational egoist. You won't care about other people unless they serve your goals. You won't attack them, you won't exploit them, but you won't care about them particularly, because what you're concerned about is your own well-being and your own flourishing. So any morality, Christianity for example, or any political system which depends upon altruism is evil. Now you can see, you might say, well, these are extremes, but these are not just two different moralities, they're opposed to each other. They're completely incompatible with each other, which is a very interesting feature of modern atheism, that it has this incompatibility. By the way, her history is interesting here, and she was Russian originally and fled Russia a few years after the Bolshevik Revolution, and she published a novel, her first novel, called We the Living, in which a heroine based clearly on herself has a Bolshevik lover. And I was very interested to manage to consult a copy of the first edition of this, because in a library in California originally, because it was impossible to buy that except for a first edition, because she'd gotten rid of certain passages in subsequent editions. And the passages she'd gotten rid of, which she said were irrelevant, they were minor, they were of no importance, they were very important and very interesting, because they showed that, like many people at the time in Russia, like almost every literate person in Russia at the time, 1890 up to about 1920, she was deeply influenced by Nietzsche, or a rather vulgar interpretation of Nietzsche anyway. So she has one particularly vivid conversation between herself, with a different name, and a Bolshevik lover, in which she says, you know, I detest your ideals. I abhor your ideals. For me, humanity is just there to be trampled on and ignored, except when there are exceptional, superior individuals.
Now go back and listen to Nazi ideology from Black Earth and Stalin's religion, and very interesting.
I loathe equality, but I love your methods. Torture, murder, enslavement. So she had this kind of, if you like, elitist view from day one, but she took that out of the first edition of her novel perhaps because she thought, maybe rightly, it wouldn't go down too well in America.
Now, what's interesting here, and what's interesting about the other video too, is John Gray is, for where he ends up in the other video where he talks about the kind of atheism that he sort of esteems, which is, again, as I said, sort of like the non-theism where John Vervaeke goes. It's very interesting though that his assumed morality, and I played a number of times, it keeps getting not really a copyright strike, but a copyright notice, this Veritas forum of Dallas Willard talking about worldviews. We are so subtle, such subtle creatures. We form this crowdsourced morality between each others by all the sort of little clues that if we posture ourselves in a certain way, we gain status. And if we say the wrong things, we lose status. And this subtly groups us into different groups and molds us into different people. And this is why, again, community is not an incidental thing. Community is not, as, again, Coleman and John McWhorter talking, the church is this environment which is full of all of these subtle clues where morality is constantly in motion, being crowdsourced and shaped and worked on, and there's leaders and they're watching followers, and I mean, it's just always a very live thing. And you can find that for all of the sort of 30,000 foot level that John Gray is using to look at this, he himself is obviously embedded in a context where the moral imaginary impinges on him. And Ayn Rand goes to America and very quickly gets the idea that I better take this stuff out of my book, or they're going to call me a moral monster, and nobody's going to buy my book, and I'm not going to have influence. So in other words, in order to have influence, you need to, morality is an incredibly important thing to align with others. And I find this constantly with the Christian anti-theist debates where there's always this subtle game that we're playing where we're trying to show that the other person is morally deficient. And that's and we do that obviously in order to curry the favor of the listener. Now, I think this is completely natural and normal, and I certainly have done it too. But what's really amazing when I read the New Testament, when I read Jesus, is that Jesus sometimes shows a complete disinterest in appearing moral or adopting the moral posture of his context, for which he cost him his life. And there's other times where he says things like, be completely indifferent to that. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Do not practice your righteousness before men so that you may receive their applause. And that is the most counterhuman thing we can do. Just to be and when we see people do it, they just want to be a jerk. But obviously with Jesus, it isn't, you're not just doing it to be a jerk. He says, well, in this deeply theist perspective, because you do so before an audience of one, and in the final analysis, it's that audience that counts. And you would think that someone like Jesus making points like this would have been discredited, but again, I think the real power behind Tom Holland's work is it shows that this one man who defied the moral status imaginary of his time dragged the Western world in to his ideas, which are very counter species, very unnatural, and he succeeded, and he's still winning often on both sides of the debate. That's an amazing thing that we think not enough about. Now, I've gone on for a little while in this video, so maybe I'll stop it here. I'm at about 26 minutes. The rest of the video is interesting too. But this is where, you know, these questions get interesting. I just saw today on Twitter, you know, a lot of question, where's Jordan? Hope he's doing okay. His, you know, people around him are putting out some things, and so there's this little doodle type thing on this one video which takes a little bit of, sounded like a part of his Maps of Meaning or Personalities course, where he's talking about, you know, choosing your sacrifice and growing up. A member, you know, a newcomer to our meetup, who's, you know, I thought really made some, has been making some real contributions to the conversation at the meetup, made the point the other day at the meetup, at our Sunday meetup, that he noticed that, you know, Jordan Peterson gave young men more ego because their egos were too thin. And when he said that, I thought, wow, yes, that's right. Now this individual, I'm hoping to get him on the channel because he's a good talker and he's smart and I really like him. But, you know, he comes from a Sikh background, and Sikhs are the Sikh religion is a very interesting religion because it grew up in the space of conflict between Islam and what we would call Hinduism. And that's you know, anybody who knows the history of India knows that is a really hot space. And there's a lot of, you know, the partition between India and Pakistan, and then later, you know, Bangladesh. There are a lot of people died. And Gandhi, who, you know, Dr. King follows to try to, you know, to release India from the colonial shackles of the British Empire, couldn't, you know, really couldn't address the enmity between Hindus and Islam. There's a hot fight. So he said, you know, he made the observation that what Jordan Peterson really gave young men was more ego. And I thought, well, that is very interesting, because in many ways the moral status imaginary is very anti-egoic. And that sort of comes through sort of the Buddhist strain that, the enemy is the ego, and the ego is the source of suffering and attachment and all of this. And so the path to non-suffering is lessening the ego. Well, I don't think that's the sort of thinning of the ego that we've seen in America. And it's been a different thinning of the ego that we've seen through, as Byrne Power talks about, fun. And as Jordan Peterson pointed out in Pinocchio, you know, going on to Treasure Island with people who are not really your friends, and wasting away your 20s and in partying, and then when you become a 30-year-old and you're still sitting at home playing video games, parents begin to worry, well, you're an old infant. When I was your age, I was already married with kids and underway and in a career, and here I'm still clueless, and, you know, choose your sacrifice. And it's a really cool, I'll put the link to it in here, a really nice treatment of some Jordan Peterson, Uncle Jordan wisdom. But this observation at the meetup that Jordan Peterson gave ego, and this sort of lends into the conversation between, you know, Jesus and the Buddha, let's say, where what Jesus does with the ego is very, very interesting, because for Jesus, you actually have to express the ego in submission. And that, I think, is very much part of of theism, of Israelite theism versus the meta-divine realm. Because what you're doing always is relational. And so you need to have an ego for the ego to submit. And you need to have a strong ego for the ego to sacrifice itself. It in fact has to be the best lamb. It has to be the best sacrifice. So it has to be the strongest of the herd in order to sacrifice. And So that's very different. And again, I probably need more conversation partners that know more about Buddhism, and maybe that's why John is a good conversation partner for me, because I very much don't want to be unfair. Because and John demonstrates this again and again. To be unfair in characterizing or criticizing a rival, or at least another party or another group, makes yourself weak, because you want, this is some of the values of the IDW. You want their best argument, because that will help you be the best argument. But this is very egoic, and Jordan Peterson came in and your ego's too thin. Gosh, how long have I been going here? I better check. Okay, maybe we have a little more time for this. I've only watched this once, so I can't really anticipate what he's going to say next, and I don't want to miss anything that when I thought about this video, I didn't want to miss.
It didn't fit into with the common American narrative in which anybody could make good in the world if they just behaved rightly and had some kind of talents.
And that's very much the American dream. And you see how we so often look at such low-resolution views of these things, where these things are very, very complicated.
So that's kind of one example. What are the others? Are atheists necessarily committed to human equality? Definitely not, because one of the big atheist movements towards the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century in Europe, was something called monism, capital M, monism. It was a religion of science, explicitly described like that, by its founder, Ernst Haeckel, who was called the Darwin of Germany, the German Darwin.
And again, if you look at the Weikart video I played, he played prominently in that, played prominently in setting up for the Nazis.
And he wanted to establish religion, had thousands of, mainly among intellectuals and professional workers and engineers, scientists and so on, was a religion of science in which, and remember, this is important, 1890, 1910, what the science, as he interpreted, it's not actually in Darwin, I don't think at all, but said was that the human animal is organized into a racial hierarchy. That was the Haeckel view, with, of course, white Europeans at the top and all the rest of humankind further down. And this was natural, these hierarchies, he said. He was also very strongly opposed to Christianity and to Judaism, quite notably anti-Semitic. And one of his goals in spreading this religion was to eliminate the Christian and Jewish elements in European culture. Voltaire, by the way, the great Enlightenment philosopher, held the same view, had the same kind of goal. So the interesting thing there is you could say, well, surely no one took that seriously. Well, one of his most famous book, The Riddle of the Universe, was published in Britain by the Rationalist Press Association, which also published H.G. Wells about 1905, published Julian Huxley. And Julian Huxley, a very famous figure in British thinking in the 30s, until really the late 30s, when Nazism was rising, or had risen, held not dissimilar views. If you read what Huxley, who also published in this Rationalist Press Association, wrote about biology, he says Africans, he means black Africans, are inferior by nature. They don't, etc. Fills that out with various insulting descriptions. And then suddenly, around about 1936, he changes it to. Now, what had happened between 1932 and 1936? Scientifically, nothing. There hadn't been some brand new discovery in science. What had happened was the rise of Nazism, which was a threat to any kind of civilized values in Europe. So we didn't hear any more of that from Huxley, though after the war, he was still talking somewhat on and off about eugenics, which was another feature of atheism at this time, because if you think that human life can be improved by science, one of the features you might start thinking about is, can the rather haphazard business of procreation and having children not be made more scientific? And if you do want to make it more scientific, which model of superiority? You say we want better people, we want to improve the species.
Essence. relevance realization. We want better people. Well, what is a better person? Tell me what that is. Well, one of the ways that this is coming into our situation now is that, well, women are pushing back childbirth. Well, what does that mean? It means in vitro fertilization. Well, you can watch that Netflix. You can watch, the Netflix has a thing on sex, and one of the things is on fertility. And, well, male sperm counts are going down, and egg counts are going down. So people are more and more looking at in vitro fertilization. They're looking at egg donors. They're looking at sperm donors. Well, now that you're looking at a donor, there's going to be a marketplace. Well, and there's going to be choice. Well, what are the choices that you are going to exert when you are picking your baby? Well, all of these value judgments are very much going to come to the fore. Well, I want a baby whose father was smart, and I want a baby whose the egg comes from a woman who is accomplished. And, well, we're not going to talk about it as eugenics, but you're picking your child.
We want to make human beings better and better. What does that mean? Where do you get the values from that? Does that mean thinner and thinner? Does it mean stronger and stronger? Cleverer and cleverer, measured by who or what, IQ? Whiter and whiter? Because, of course, many of these people were, right up to really the 30s, were.
Or maybe a lovely tan that's just, tan enough so that the whites love the color of your skin, but of color enough so that you can qualify to be a POC.
What we would now, I think, rightly call racists. So here's another one. No human equality. Another example of atheism without these, no human equality, but hierarchy instead, with people who are further down the hierarchy counting less and less as you go down. And this is actually, I think, is a feature of atheism, which many people have accused Christianity of, and other monotheistic religions. Say, well, the values of these religions are always the values of their time. They just say God sanctioned them. I think there might be some truth in that, but there's also some truth in that with regard to atheism. Most atheists at any one time hold to the values of their time. So in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, they were almost universally in Western countries racist values. So they all coloured in that way. H.G. Wells, a writer I admire in his fiction, his science fiction, I think is absolutely wonderful. He wrote a book called Anticipations, which he published, if I remember right, non-fiction book, 1902. And he says, what about the non-efficient peoples of the world? The non-efficient peoples of the world. Then he explicitly said, the yellow, the brown, and the black. What about them? He said, well, the world isn't a charity, they'll have to go. H.G. Wells. So these ideas, these values, these were very common, and they were promoted by atheists. In fact, although I'm not a Christian, and I think some of the few critics actually at that time, as at the time of slavery and before the time of slavery, the time when the conquistadors went to Latin America and destroyed some of the civilizations there, some of the few critics were actually religious, because they held to a belief in the divinely ordained equality of human beings.
You'll notice that Bartolomé de las Casas makes an appearance in Tom Holland's Dominion.
They all had souls. Whereas among some of the atheists, many of that time, the idea was what mattered is not having a soul. There was no soul, it was how clever you are, how intelligent you might be. Now, of course, there was no basis for this pseudoscience of intelligence, just as I think there's no basis for the present obsession, which is coming back now with IQ. I say that partly because I've known many extraordinarily clever people who are also extremely stupid. That's just an anecdotal point, but I think the rigor of IQ testing is a very disputable kind of issue. But that's another. So in other words, there's no connection between liberalism and liberal values on the one hand, no deep connection, and no historical connection between atheism and liberal values. So we're getting on to the next question I'm going to ask now, which is about morality itself.
And you can listen to the thing yourself. And I actually don't think the end of it is quite as good as the middle, which is why I played the middle. But the end was he hadn't really structured his speech very well. But I'm not really one to point fingers. And so this point of ego, I think, is interesting, both ego and effectiveness. And Coleman Hughes makes this point. And one of the things that I was thinking of is the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. and individuals walking with signs, "I am a man." It's a very egoic statement. It's a very egoic idea, and fascinating the way these things work. So yeah, I think that's the last slide I've got. Whoops. Yeah. So yep, there's the last slide. I'll wrap it up here, and maybe I'll leave all the links to the videos down in the notes. And if you want to watch them, those other conversations with John Gray, I found full of a lot of very good information.